Here's a guy who thinks he has good rebuttals to a bunch of atheist arguments.
One of the most common atheist arguments is that religion causes wars. Historical analysis shows that this claim is exaggerated. Out of all recorded human wars, only about 7% were primarily caused by religion.
If only 2 conflicts were ever caused by religion, the claim that religion causes them is literally true and not an exaggeration. The claim is not religion causes all of them, or even religion causes most of them. Even if only 7% are caused by religion, that would imply that 7% of them would never have happened if it weren't for religion. That's not a very strong defense. Also, how exactly do you calculate this? It seems to me that religion is a weapon in conflict far more often than a cause. The Crusades, for example, were fought so the church could retain and expand its territorial control. Religion was just used to justify them and motivate people to fight in them. I am far less concerned about religion causing conflict than I am with it being used as a weapon of conflict.
If Islamic conflicts are removed from that number, it drops closer to 3%. The vast majority of wars have been fought over political power, territory, resources, or ethnic rivalries. While religion has at times been misused as a justification for violence, it is not the dominant driver of war in human history.
This sounds like a fallacy of relative privation to me. You seem to be arguing that other factors cause conflict more often, so we shouldn't be concerned by the conflicts that religion causes. That just doesn't logically follow.
Another frequent objection is that a lot of evil has been done in the name of religion. This is true, but it cannot be used as proof that religion itself is false.
I don't recall anyone ever arguing that religion is false because people do bad things in the name of religion. People who bring up the bad things people do in the name of religion seem to be making the point that given that religion is false, believing in it is not always harmless. The fact that it is false is not the only reason not to believe in it. It is also sometimes harmful to believe in it. I often hear the reverse argument from people who defend religion. They say that religion does a lot of good and that atheism is harmful and shouldn't be believed even if it is true.
For example, individuals such as Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot, who rejected religion entirely, were responsible for some of the deadliest regimes in history. The point is not that atheism is to blame for their crimes, but rather that human evil can manifest under both religious and secular systems.
And it seems at least as common under religious systems.
Atheists also argue that if someone were born in another country, they would not be a Christian. While cultural background does influence what people believe, this reasoning applies equally to atheism.
When atheists bring this up, the intent is not to show that religion is false, but rather to show that religious people who just went along with whatever religion they were raised to believe don't hold their own beliefs to the same level of scrutiny as they hold the beliefs of other religions. In most English-speaking countries, though, the predominant view is Christianity. Atheists who live in these countries are more likely to be atheist in spite of their culture rather than because of it. Therefore, they are more likely to have questioned their cultural upbringing rather than simply uncritically adopting it.
An atheist born in a strongly religious culture would likely not hold the same views either. Context shapes beliefs, but it does not decide which worldview is true.
The point is that if you simply go along with whatever view you were raised to believe, you are less likely to have examined it very carefully than someone who sought out beliefs that are different from the ones with which they were raised. A Christian who was raised in a Christian country is less likely to have critically examined their religion than a Christian who was raised in a Muslim country.
The real question remains, which explanation of reality best fits the evidence of human existence, morality, and the universe itself?
Well, it's certainly not theism, because the idea that something could create space-time, which is what the universe is, out of nothing is incoherent. You can't create something when it already exists, and there was obviously never a time when space and time did not already exist. Therefore, it is a contradiction to say that they were created. Humans exist because of evolution, and morality exists because of a combination of evolution and social construction.
Another argument is the claim, how do you know which religion is true? This question assumes that the existence of many faiths discredits the truth of any single one.
No, that's not the point of the argument. Like the argument about people usually believing in the religion that is most common in their culture, the point of this argument is to point out that theists rarely subject their own religions to the same level of skepticism as they do other religions. Christians rarely become Christians because they looked at literally every other religion and decided that Christianity was the most probable. Some Christians, like William Lane Craig, will openly admit that the reason he believes in Christianity is because he desperately wants it to be true, and that he consequently holds it to a lower epistemic standard than the standard he applies to evaluating contrary views.
But everyone, whether religious or not, holds a worldview that they place faith in. Some worldviews are labeled religious, and others are considered secular, but each one requires a foundation of trust in unseen truths.
Agnosticism doesn't. What truth, seen or unseen, do you have to trust in order to simply be unconvinced that there is a God?
The task is to examine which worldview best explains the origin of the universe,
The universe didn't have an origin. There was never a time when the universe wasn't already here. The universe is the space-time continuum, so even if time hasn't existed infinitely, it is still the case that there was never a time when it didn't already exist. Things only need origins if there was a time before they existed. If there was a time when the universe did not exist and then it suddenly appeared, then it would make sense to ask where it came from, what its origin is. But that's not the case with the universe. Because the universe, or multiverse as the case may be, encompasses all of time by definition, there was never a time when it didn't already exist. It didn't need to come here from an origin because there was never a time when it wasn't already here.
The reality of moral law.
I think by the reality of moral law, you mean that there are objective oughts. I don't understand how there could possibly be objective oughts, even if there is a God, because even if a God dictated moral rules, there is no objective, non-circular reason why those rules ought to be followed.
The presence of consciousness.
Consciousness consists of the actions of thinking, feeling, perceiving, deliberating, etc. What is carrying out these actions if not a brain?
And the purpose of life.
You don't have to explain the existence of things that don't exist.
Another common claim is that there's no scientific proof that God exists. This argument misunderstands both science and God.
Proof in the empirical sciences is more loosely defined than in logic and math. An overwhelming preponderance of evidence will typically be considered proof, even if it doesn't produce a deductively inferred conclusion. I would go further and say that there is not only no scientific proof that God exists, there couldn't be because there's no way to give any kind of proof of an incoherent claim.
Science, by definition, studies the natural world. Things that can be measured, tested, and observed.
In other words, things whose existence can actually be meaningfully distinguished from their non-existence.
God, by definition, exists beyond the natural world. That means science cannot prove or disprove God in the same way it cannot scientifically prove concepts like human rights, moral truths, or the existence of love.
Human rights are invented, like money and baseball. They are a practice, not some woo-woo platonic forms. Moral truths don't exist, and love is a neurological phenomenon whose occurrence has been scientifically demonstrated. Love is a feeling. What is carrying out this feeling if it isn't the brain?
These are real, but they belong to categories outside the limits of laboratory testing.
So do volcanoes. That doesn't mean they can't be scientifically demonstrated to exist.
Some insist there is no evidence of anything supernatural. Yet history and medical documentation point to cases that strongly challenge a purely naturalistic worldview.
The problem with the idea of the supernatural is that it's not clear what it's even supposed to be. Even if someone could be thoroughly, empirically confirmed to have died and come back to life, I still couldn't understand what it would mean for this to be a supernatural occurrence. I also don't understand why it could not be something that happened via some heretofore undiscovered natural mechanism.
Reports of demonic possession include individuals speaking languages they never learned or demonstrating knowledge they had no access to.
How exactly would you be able to rule out that they weren't really speaking the language they reportedly were speaking, or that they secretly had knowledge of it? What's the more probable explanation, that they spoke at least a few words of a language that nobody else knew they spoke, or that they were possessed by demons? I don't understand how anyone could infer the latter to be more probable than the former.
Near-death experiences also show people acquiring verified information while unconscious or clinically dead.
How exactly was this information verified? Or how was it verified that they acquired the knowledge while clinically dead? Again, what's more probable, that they actually acquired it before or after they were dead? Or that their soul left their body and then carried out a research project?
These accounts may be debated, but they cannot be dismissed as if there were no evidence at all.
They can, in fact, be dismissed as evidence of the supernatural because there's no coherent definition of the supernatural. Something has to be coherently defined before anyone can discern what evidence for such a thing would even look like.
Another objection is that the Bible has contradictions. This argument assumes that supposed inconsistencies in Scripture prove it unreliable.
More specifically, these contradictions show that either biblical literalism is false or biblical inerrancy is false.
But for 2,000 years, theologians and scholars have examined and explained these apparent conflicts.
The majority of the explanations for biblical contradictions that I've seen prioritize coming up with some possible explanation that preserves the idea of inerrancy over making the most probably correct inference. For example, when God says to Adam and Eve that if they eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge, they'll die that day. Since they went on to have at least 2 kids after they ate the fruit, this contradicts what God said would happen. The explanations that I've seen say things like they died a spiritual death rather than a biological death, whatever that's even supposed to mean. But nothing in the text says or even implies that God meant they would die a spiritual rather than biological death the day they ate the fruit.
Often what looks like a contradiction is clarified by context, differences in perspective, or translation issues.
Or the explanation is just made up ad hoc, like the spiritual death thing.
For example, the 4 Gospels highlight different details of the same events, much like multiple eyewitnesses would. Variation in detail does not equal contradiction.
When one gospel says that Jesus was crucified the day of the preparation for the Passover, which is the day before Passover, but all of the others say he was crucified the day after the Last Supper, which was the Passover Seder, that's not just a difference in details, it's a contradiction. They can't both be true.
But can actually strengthen the reliability of the overall record. Atheists also argue that the Gospels were anonymous, implying we do not know who wrote them. In reality, anonymity in ancient writings does not mean total uncertainty of authorship.
Perhaps the author's contemporaries knew who wrote them, but we don't. And the main purpose of pointing this out is to caution against giving the Gospels the same evidentiary weight as a first-hand eyewitness account. We don't have sufficient reason to believe that they are first-hand accounts.
Early church fathers who lived close to the time of the apostles recorded who wrote the Gospels, and their testimony consistently matches the traditional attributions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Given that these folks were illiterate fishermen, the claims of the early church fathers are rather far-fetched.
The absence of a signature in the text itself does not negate the strong historical evidence for their authorship.
It wouldn't negate it if such evidence existed.
Another objection is that the Gospels misquote Jesus. Some secular scholars argue that parts of the Gospels are a blend of authentic sayings from Jesus and later additions by the early church.
Well, how else would you explain the fact that the passage in John in which Jesus is quoted as saying, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," is absent from all of the earliest manuscripts and only starts appearing in manuscripts from over 100 years after the earliest ones we have were written?
The difficulty is that these same scholars cannot agree on which sayings are genuine and which are not.
Why would that matter? I'm more interested in what arguments they have for why a particular passage is a misquote, rather than in whether they agree or disagree with one another. Evaluate each argument for its own merits.
Because of this lack of consensus, their claims cannot carry decisive weight.
That's a complete non sequitur. Again, look at the quality of the arguments they make. The fact that they don't unanimously convince each other is not nearly as important a measure of their claims as the quality of the actual arguments they give you.
The Gospels have been preserved and transmitted with extraordinary care, and the church fathers who knew the apostles affirmed their accuracy.
How would they be able to affirm their accuracy if they weren't witnesses to the events described themselves? And if they were witnesses themselves, why didn't they write their own Gospels?
A frequent argument is that Jesus never claimed to be God. While Jesus did not walk around saying the exact words, "I am God, worship me,"
He also didn't say anything that implies that he is God. Every argument I've seen that claims otherwise relies on some pretty twisted interpretations that certainly are not the most probably correct ones.
his actions and teachings revealed his divine identity.
How so? Nothing he is quoted as saying is so absurd as to be impossible for a human to come up with, and even if he did the miracles attributed to him, that would, at best, only be strong evidence that he was a great magician, like Simon Magus was described in Acts as being.
In all four Gospels, Jesus does things that only God can do, such as forgiving sins.
Jesus actually explains that the Son of Man, a mere representative of God, also has the authority to forgive sins.
Calming storms by command.
Why couldn't a powerful magician do that? The mere fact that Jesus had that power doesn't prove that he has all powers.
And receiving worship.
The book of Exodus portrays a golden calf receiving worship. Clearly that's not something only God can do.
He often challenged his followers with the question, "Who do you say that I am?" which forced them to recognize his true nature.
No, it doesn't. It just forces them to guess what his true nature is.
After his resurrection, his disciples openly confessed him as God, and Jesus affirmed their faith.
He didn't affirm it by saying that he is God. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.